All right. So, this is probably the first time I have a co-host, which is Blake. So, Blake, can you like introduce yourself first for the audience?
Hi, I'm Blake. I have a pretty extensive background with coaching MMA and wrestling, and I was a amateur fighter for some time myself. And I'm relatively new to the strength conditioning world, so kind of integrating my skill side of the sport with the strength and conditioning, and yeah, that's what I'm doing here.
Cool. So, uh, the guest today is Gav. Gav, like, can you introduce yourself for the audience?
Sure. So currently, I'm the director of strength and conditioning at the UFC Performance Institute. Prior to that, I was working in China for 6 years. 3 of those years was with the UFC as the manager of their academy program. Prior to that, I was working with Chinese surfing for about a year, and then Chinese Olympic-based sports for about 2 years before that, working into the national games. I've been a strength conditioning coach since about 1998. So some of you probably weren't even born then, but we've been going at it for quite a long time, and it's been a pretty cool journey that whole time, I reckon.
Do you enjoy your time in China?
I loved it. I love it. There's definitely components of Shanghai and some of the islands out there where I was able to get waves that I miss dearly. I really love the people on the ground level as well. Just fantastic humans and such a contrast to I guess a lot of the places I've lived in my life, and that's why I loved it.
Cool. So, if I'm gonna ask you like the most like one thing you miss the most in China, what would you pick?
Ooh, um, the the variety. So just walking down the street every single day, I would come back with a story, and I love that about life. Just coming back, whether it's one thing or a number of things, there's just so many unique things that I want to take in. I feel like that, I talk about this with friends who are in the industry as well. We've got this great opportunity to live overseas and live in unique places, whereas sometimes if you're in a particular industry, you don't have that opportunity. Your license only holds you to that country that you got that qualification in. Strength and conditioning coaches and physiotherapists, we can travel the world. And I think just the understanding of when I was in China, knowing that I was there under my job, getting to experience this different culture was a really cool thing that I got to experience.
Nice, nice, nice. So, I personally have some question for you, but since like Blake is the one who is really good at uh boxing, wrestling, and he's really into like UFC, I'm gonna let him start first, okay?
Go for it. Ask away, boys.
Okay, Blake.
Well, my first question: What did you have any interest in MMA before you started working for the UFC? Were you a fan of the sport, or had you worked with any athletes before that?
Yeah,
MMA athletes?
Yeah, I love MMA. I'm from the very first UFC, and watching Tank Abbott was my favorite back in the early days. He was just an animal, and I loved that. It was so far beyond anything I'd ever seen. So I really got into it. I was playing different sports, so it's not the sport that I ever thought I would get into. In terms of me personally, it's been more the striking based sports. So boxing, Muay Thai has been what I've done just for myself over the years. But prior to that, in the Gold Coast, I was working with some young amateur MMA athletes. And then when I moved to China, I was working with boxing, wrestling, judo, taekwondo. So a number of different martial arts.
Oh, that's right, because you were with
Mm.
the Olympic sports. Gotcha. I
Yeah.
actually heard on a podcast I was listening recently that the surfing didn't pay you for 8 months.
Yes. Yeah. And you know what? This is a lesson, right? Like I understand the benefit that I have in the current role that I have. And it's a cool job and I love it. But there's a process, right? And I think that's one of the key things for young coaches to realize is that it takes time to get to those positions and sometimes a lot of sacrifice. And for me, that role in surfing for me, at that time, was a dream job to be able to work and create this job, or create this team based on a river wave in the middle of China. I mean, that's just the unique as it gets. So I was willing to go through a bit of hell there to make sure that I got that gig over the line, and then funding cut it. So I wasn't paid for 8 months and lived in a hotel room for 8 months away from my wife, who was in Australia. And we're like, don't come over here yet. I'm not getting paid. So stay back in Australia
Yeah.
and keep working. So, there's a journey involved with where you're at. And I think it's just important to remember that and enjoy as best you can.
Yeah, I mean, I heard on another podcast that the story with you and your wife through COVID and everything is tumultuous.
Yeah, that was
Getting
hectic.
through that whole thing.
Yeah, that was almost 2 years
Yeah,
of being apart from each other. And, obviously each time I went to visit her back in Australia, it would be 2 weeks either side of quarantine in a single room, 2 weeks in Australia, and then back in China 2 weeks. Those are like two of the worst countries in COVID, and we got stuck in each of them. So
yeah.
it wasn't that much fun for sure.
Goodness. All right. Well, I want to get into a little bit of your job here. So, when you get a new athlete on the roster, what's kind of the onboarding process of getting them going with the S&C program?
Yeah, so I guess with the UFC PI, it's important for your audience to understand that they don't have to use any or all of the services at the UFC Performance Institute. Those are optional for them, but they are free of charge once they're on the roster. So they can utilize S&C, they can utilize physical therapy, nutrition, the mat space upstairs. That's all free of charge to them, but they could use one or two of those opportunities if they wanted to. So with regards to specific S&C, if they do want to utilize us, we have tier 1 diagnostics or tier 1 profiling, which we utilize to really get a good understanding and a clearer picture of where that athlete currently sits in relation to their weight class. And then we can go about programming the most optimal prescriptions for them based on that. We also have tier 2 based tests, which actually highlight even further what that information we've got from the tier 1 tests. If as a coach you wanted to get a bit more insight, you could use whatever tier 2 test you would like to shine a bit more information on that athlete. So I guess to clarify, tier 1 are 4 tests, and we use them with each athlete unless there's an injury, of course. And then we've got a great set of normative data now that we can use specifically for MMA. Instead of comparing the footballers or another sport, it's specifically for MMA athletes, specifically for their weight class and gender. And then as a coach, if you wanted to add more insight, you can use a tier 2 base test.
Okay. So, what kind of challenges do you run into with a new athlete in regards to working with their team and their current coaches?
I think the hardest thing is when they're not based in Vegas and understanding, so we might do remote programming for them, understanding what their weekly schedule is like. And at a lot of gyms, it's not always the head coach that's taking every session, obviously, right? So you might have the head coach that's overseeing a lot of the progress of the athlete, but they might go and do wrestling with a wrestling coach and jiu-jitsu with their jiu-jitsu coach, striking with their striking coach. Now, sometimes the biggest problem is that none of those guys are communicating or know the intensity of the last session. So
Oh yeah,
everyone wants 100% out of that athlete.
yeah.
And then they come to you and they're exhausted. And so you had a plan written out. You need to be, I guess, adaptable, because it is important. The most important part of an MMA athlete's training is their technical training, improving their skill sets. And we, as S&C coaches, underpin that physiology. But we need to make sure that at certain times we are sort of involved in the prioritization of that athlete. And we just got to be adaptable and work with it.
Yeah, I run into that problem just with teaching wrestling at my one gym with 10 fighters. They'll come to class and I'll be like, all right, what'd you do yesterday? And they're like, oh, we did, 20 sprints and then 5 minute rounds hard. I'm like, okay,
Yeah.
well, now I guess we can't do what I had planned. So
Yep. Yep.
yeah, especially the more I've learned with strength conditioning, the more really the easier I take it on the athletes, because usually by the time they get to my class on Friday, it's they're spent.
especially Friday. By Friday,
Yeah,
Friday is a very low key session most of the time, isn't it?
yeah.
Yeah,
Um,
I want to ask like you mentioned, the most important thing for like the fighters is their technical training. Am I right? So I think this is a part that not just UFC fighters, it's like all sport, like basketball, football, sprinters. I think the most important part is the technical training. So how as like strength and conditioning coaches, how can we like try to adapt or how can we try to like cooperate? What is the communication going to be like?
I mean, the simplest way is to have a conversation with your athlete, as Blake was saying. He asks them how they're feeling, and that's usually a pretty good recommendation. I have noticed in MMA though they're pretty headstrong and Type A personalities, so they don't like to take it easy at all. So sometimes we'll utilize things like velocity-based training to look at target zones. So if we do want a particular adaptation, say strength and power or strength power. Outcomes or adaptations, maybe you're looking at 0.75 to 0.85 meters per second on a particular lift. And if they go below that, then you're moving the bar too slow and we're not actually getting the adaptation we want. So we've got to take a little bit of weight off. The reason I like that is that it's motivational for the athlete. So they're still trying their hardest to get the most out of that session within reason. And we can auto regulate that session based on the speed at which they're moving the bar. The other thing is you might just deload and simply a deload. You're looking at, usually 40 to 60% of the volume of the previous week. So it might just be cutting a set off here and there, but still making sure that your intensity is there, which is the load-based prescription. So instead of 4 sets of 4 at 80 kilos, sorry, I'm speaking in kilos, but 80 kilos, then maybe it's 3 sets of 4 at 80 kilos, and you've just taken a bit of volume out of their training. I mean, to be honest, it is surprising and fascinating how much the human body is capable of. And I do feel we've got to be careful of almost going too easy on athletes sometimes, but we've also got to look at the whole picture as well and say, look, if they've just done conditioning, like Blake said, they did 20 sprints, why would we then add another 15 sprints to our session, even though we planned it? So it's just I guess it's common sense, but common sense is not so common. So sometimes having some plans of attack as well.
yeah, you kind of touched on it a little bit. Kind of leads into my next question with what are common faults you see with training programs that are made by the athlete's home gym? Like, are there any trends that you see throughout, gyms that like bits of S&C that they're missing at most gyms, or maybe, I mean, from my personal perspective, it's overtraining is really what I see. But is there anything that you see in regards to that?
I guess it's a two-part answer. Obviously, not throwing any one or any method under the bus, but you know, we need to look at as S&C coaches, what are the missing pieces, rather than continually pushing areas that they're already getting in technical training. So if they're doing 5-minute rounds of jiu-jitsu, 10 5-minute rounds of jiu-jitsu, that's a fairly good aerobic conditioning prescription. Have they done their alactic maximal power based prescriptions? Where did they do that? Did they do that in pads, or was that also more of an aerobic conditioning? So what are they missing in their technical training, and where can we supplement that, rather than let's add on to what they're already doing and trying to think about, say, instead of doing 3 5-minute round circuits, because that's how they fight. So, well, they're sparring 2 days a week doing that. So what aren't they doing is maybe a better way to look at it, and how can we supplement that in our training?
Yeah, from my experience through their fight camps, what ends up happening a lot is this almost every hard session turns into like a maximal aerobic session, and they miss the anaerobic, and then they miss the power and the speed in their training, and they end up going into a fight in shape, but not necessarily athletic, if you will.
Yeah. And often not peaking either, because they
Yeah,
do all the way up to the fight. And yeah, it's that whole fitness fatigue paradigm, right? You increase your fitness, but at the same time you increase your fatigue. So at what point are you dropping off that fatigue level by deloading and tapering? And that's the whole point of a deload and taper. And I can understand why they do it, because you fought, and me myself thinking of going into a fight, I'm like, well, I want to do more than my opponent, so I'm just going to keep training. But that's actually not the ideal thing to do leading into that last sort of 2-week taper, because by the time it gets to the fight, you're gassed and you're exhausted. So we want to save some of that, and we want to get you to the fight where you're bouncing off the walls going, let me out there, I've got so much energy to give, rather than like I just scraped through to the finish line and now I have to fight. Damn, that's the hardest bit.
Yeah, it's absolutely a struggle trying to keep fighters down. I mean, I did the same thing when I was training. It's just like you said, you want to do the most, you want to do more than your opponent, but you're not actually doing the smartest work.
Yes, there's a time and a place, right? And that's
Right.
usually specific prep early fight camp is where you can get after it a bit more. Like if you want to put in that effort, that's a good 6 to 8 week phase, specific prep early fight camp, where you can tear it up a little bit. But then late fight camp, that last 3 weeks, we speak about it in Shanghai a lot. Dean Amersinger, the head coach out there, has sort of highlighted how he likes to do it. And it's that T-3, or the time 3 weeks before the fight. That's your last hard week, or your last high week. And then you've got that 2-week taper. And that last week includes the weight cut week as well, where you can't be expected to do a great deal. That to me makes a hell of a lot of sense. It works with the science in terms of the time frame as well. So I think if you can look at it that way, it's probably a good way to start.
Yeah. Yeah. This kind of leads into what I was going to ask next. I've heard you talk on other podcasts about decay rates. Could you give us a quick overview of decay rates?
Yeah, this has sort of come from Issurin, one of the authors in the literature, and he speaks about, if you don't use a particular adaptation, such as maximal strength, if you don't train and target that, how long does that adaptation last before it starts dissipating? And, obviously this is general terms, because not everyone's going to be in the same boat, but it's a really cool little guideline for us as S&C coaches to work out when we need to train a particular adaptation. As an example, maximal strength, supposedly if you don't train for maximal strength, you can hang on to those adaptations for around 30 days. So now you start thinking of your periodization strategies and going, well, if I can get away with it, maybe I don't do it in sort of those last 3 weeks. Because if you look at what speed and power decay rates are, they're looking more around the 7 to 8 days if you don't train them. So they can dissipate or decay at a much faster rate than, say, maximal strength. So they're probably of more value to do closer to the fight. And it makes a lot of sense too, because you're likely not going to be as centrally nervous system fatigued if you're doing more of your resistance training speed work. As you would if you're doing like heavy lifts around 90%, 1RM sort of thing. So it's a fine balance, I guess. And that is quite similar for ESD as well. Like even things like one of the latest ones we're looking at is how do we maintain muscular strength endurance, as that's a huge part of MMA, but training to improve your strength endurance creates a fair bit of fatigue and soreness a lot of the time. So we're looking at things like blood flow restriction to try and improve that component without making the athlete too sore after the sessions and too fatigued. But that's a work in progress at the moment.
How many, I guess, research endeavors do you have your hand in at any given time?
It's a funny question, Blake, because every day we're doing something that is driving the sport forward. And I mean, our mantra is to accelerate the evolution of mixed martial arts. But we're so busy, we can't release any of the information. So it's kind of frustrating. I mean, I've just been, it feels like on a bit of a neck crusade of late, just from doing presentations at the Australian Strength and Conditioning Conference. That kind of went off a little bit. And we've had that information for a year. you know?
Yeah.
Yeah. And we just can't find time to go and tell people about it. And there's so many little projects like that we've got going on at the UFCPI, not just in Vegas, but in Shanghai as well. And it's really exciting. We are looking to, so if you and your listeners are aware, that there's the UFC cross-sectional analysis volume 2 that was released around 2019, 2020, I believe. That's 3 years ago. So that's quite a while, and we've definitely got some more data since then. And we're looking to release a certification as well, actually, in MMA. It's got MMA specific stuff from our coaches, but also strength and conditioning, nutrition, physical therapy, and people can go through from level 1, 2, and 3. So by level 3, what we're working on right now, that's got all that information, all the data sets that we're currently creating. So we've found that might be an option for us to let people know about what we're doing.
Oh wow, I didn't know about that. That's awesome.
Yeah,
It's
it's on the
definitely something
quiet.
I'll.
It's kind of on the quiet, but not really.
Yeah.
When are you guys gonna launch it? When are you guys gonna launch?
When hopefully, well, 2024, definitely. I don't know exactly when because a lot of it will come down to it'll be linked to our website, which also has to be launched as well. That's not released. So it'll all be found on the UFC Performance Institute website, which hasn't been released. We need to kind of release them at the same time. There's no point putting the website out and not having the certification, and also having the certification but no link to the website. So we're just waiting for those two things to come out.
Gotcha. Yeah, and I was going to ask when y'all plan on coming out with the 3.0, Journal 3.0.
Yeah, I don't know. I think we'll most likely push it more into this certification because it's really in
Okay.
depth. The way that the certification works is level 1 is let's talk about S&C. If you're someone that's just interested in S&C but has no qualifications, level 1 is a perfect place to start, where you can learn all the foundational components of strength and conditioning. Once you've ticked that box and done the exam, because there are exams as well, level 2 will then dig a little bit deeper into more general sports specificity and how you can utilize that in your role on a day-to-day. And then level 3 is all the stuff we're doing at the PI from a strength and conditioning standpoint. So more combat sports related.
That's
So
that's that's very exciting. That's
yeah,
awesome.
so um I know a lot of certification or like whatever that is. They more they tend to focus more on just strength and conditioning. So do you find like it is important to like maybe cooperate with or try to put together, try to observe the movement, what the athlete is doing, the more tactical or technical side of thing? Is it?
So are you sort of saying, is it important for S&C coaches
Yeah.
to understand
Yeah.
different departments and how you can integrate with them?
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. I also think, we talk about being a generalist and being a specialist. I think when you're starting your career, you should definitely be a specialist, because that's how you'll get your foot in the door to organizations, is being really good at what you do. And then from that point, it's about trying to learn as much as you can as to how you can best help integrate with other departments. For S&C coaches, we're obviously highly involved and integrated with physical therapy and sports medicine in terms of athletes' return to play. Injury prevention or mitigation is really important. But within combat sports, particularly MMA, we have a really high relationship with the dietitian team. If we're looking at weight cuts, we might be looking at hypertrophy mitigation. We might be looking at an athlete who wants to go up a weight class. So we might actually have to put on lean muscle as well. So these conversations are important, and we can definitely take a little bit from each area. Obviously, the most important one is the MMA department in our sense, and understanding what they're training and their skill set, what they want from us. It might not always be the thing that's written in those theory books when we were learning in university and college, right? But that doesn't matter because it hasn't existed in MMA before. Like, a lot of the stuff we learn is in track and field and your time distance based sports, not this chaotic nature where you're getting punched in the face while you're trying to, you know, wrestle someone to the ground and then getting an elbow to the head. That doesn't happen in regular sort of track and field based sports. So we have to adapt and be our own unique little space, I think, and not being too headstrong with our ideas. It's like, no, the book said this. It's like, well, if you're going to do that, the coach won't have anything to do with you, and then you're absolutely no help to that athlete. So just be adaptable.
Yeah, and that's what's so exciting to me about what you all do is MMA is a relatively new sport. I mean, if you look at how long, when did UFC one was 94, right?
93. We just had our 30-year anniversary this year.
93, that's right, that's right. And so it's a 30-year-old sport, and for the first 10, 15 years, it doesn't look like it didn't look like it does now.
It
So
is a different sport. Yeah.
yeah, there's a lot of room for innovation and really just figuring it out,
Yeah. Well,
and
when
that's what's super exciting about this to me.
it's the best. Like, how many sports can you say that about? Right.
Right, it's like you're like a pioneer.
Yeah. It's like we've always done it this way. Well, we haven't actually, not in MMA. So we're trying to create that way and guidelines. And I think it takes a certain person to get involved with MMA because we don't know, and you need to be okay with not knowing, and you need to be able to ask questions and get feedback and be okay with that feedback, because this is the whole forming process, is trying to get everyone involved rather than just saying it's this way and that's it, and don't argue the question. You know, one of the things we like to do as a department at the UFC in strength and conditioning is, if someone has an idea, we'll pursue that idea, and we'll challenge the idea within our own group. Because I always say, if you're going to present this stuff publicly in an open space, there will be someone who challenges you on this. So we better have had the answers first. We better have challenged ourselves first before we start providing this information to the public for people to utilize. It has to be scrutinized within our own department first. And hopefully we do a good job of that. So when we do finally publicize it, there's answers to the questions people have for us.
Yeah, and I that's one thing that I love about MMA is in relation to like what you're doing is kind of figuring it out as you go and using observation. The sport itself kind of emulates that, like the progression of combining all the martial arts together and seeing what happens when anything goes. So
You learn off others, and you
yeah,
take, like, one of the things when I started in Shanghai was, I don't know how strong enough is for an MMA
yeah,
athlete. Like, if I'm getting them into bench or squat or deadlift, like, how heavy do we go before we start looking at more power and speed based things? So all of a sudden, just from that question, I've now created like 18 months of data with the S&C crew, where now we can actually look at weight class based athletes and go, for your weight class, you should be trap bar deadlifting this, you should be benching this, chin up this, safety bar box squat that. And then when you've ticked those boxes, and your isometric mid-thigh pull for your static strength, when you've ticked all those boxes, now we can start looking at low velocity profiles and basing you on those prescriptions, because now where you're deemed strong enough.
does that does your strength and conditioning data on like say a specific fighter coming onto the roster, does that ever factor into when they take a fight, or is that all their manager at their discretion?
Yeah, that's not on us, but one area that we do utilize our S&C information for is within the academy program, and this is kind of within the last 6 to 8 months we've been doing this, and it's super cool. We haven't used it a great deal because we haven't had to, but the idea is really cool. So basically, in off camp in Shanghai, they'll train 3 days a week of S&C. When we test them, like I was saying, we've got our 4 traditional base lifts, 2 upper body, 2 lower body, and then 1 static strength for the isometric mid-thigh pull. If we've ticked all those boxes and they're considered strong enough, we need to think about now in an academy program, they're in an academy not because they're not strong enough now, it's because maybe they're not skillful enough. So we then go and have a chat to the head coach and say, look, this person's ticked all the boxes. This athlete's ticked all the boxes for their strength. Do you think we could cut down 1 S&C session, so they've got 2 a week, and add that 3rd session to be a technical based session with you guys working on the specific skill set that you feel they need to develop a little bit more? So therefore, we're giving them an opportunity to get better at their sport. We're still making sure that their strength and conditioning is up to UFC level. To us, that makes a lot of sense as to how we navigate their training schedule for the week.
Is that
Interesting.
is is that conversation like, how is that conversation gonna go? Because usually it's like SNC coach is gonna be want to do more on the strength and conditioning side. They want like the head coach to do less. That's how like maybe like teams for the athlete or the team sport environment usually was. But so how was the conversation with the head coach like, oh, maybe cut some SNC sessions and do more tactical?
Well, we were very fortunate in the head coach, Dean Amasinger, comes from a strength and conditioning background as well. He's one of the best coaches I've ever seen in terms of like structuring a training week and basing it on moderate, high, low, and thinking about drill duration and intensities, sparring intensities. It's all thought out. We get RPEs from the athletes after every session so that we know if we're actually on the right track with what our coach prediction was. It's fantastic, A-class stuff in Shanghai. And so that conversation is easy because he's keen for that as well. Our goal in the academy is to get them into the UFC. It's not to make them really good in the gym. It's to get them into the UFC and be successful in the UFC. So what is it that they need for that to happen? Well, as we can see, it's not getting them stronger because they're already above their weight class and sometimes setting records for that weight class. Are we wasting our time getting them that 0.5% stronger than they already are? Of course we are. Let's try and give them something where there's a deficiency. And maybe that's their skill set. I can't think of any other sport where being okay at your skill will get you to the elite level. It's not going to happen. We've got people who are really good in the gym and can lift a lot of weight, but maybe they just don't have the skill set. So it's pretty obvious for us. But again, that comes down to two things: not having the ego as an S&C coach to think that you're the person that's going to change everything and anything about them. But secondly, it's also about understanding MMA is just not a regular field or team-based sport. It's just not. And when we're in Shanghai, it's an academy, so that means we're training individuals in a team environment. That's the biggest challenge. Like if we've got 16 people in the gym at one time, you're the only person going into that octagon. None of the other crew that we're training are going in there with you. It's you. So we got to make sure that 1 hour we have with you in the gym is focused on what you need, not what just a general sweep across all the athletes in there, because they're so different. Are they wrestling background, striking background? How do they want to fight? What's their tactics going into this? What's their fight IQ like? What's their energy system, their strength and power, mobility, injury? All these things have to come into it. And now put them in a team environment, it becomes a big challenge. And this is why we need to start bucketing athletes based on what they need.
Absolutely. So I wanted to give you a chance to talk about the neck research that you've been doing.
Yeah, so a lot of it, when I looked at the ways, I guess going back a little bit, when I started in MMA, I was like, there doesn't seem to be much from a strength and conditioning standpoint we're doing to try and prevent concussions. Now, we still don't know if improving neck strength actually stops concussions or prevents them. But like I keep saying, the least harm is that we're decreasing injury risk and giving them more time on the mat to get better at their sport. Because in MMA, we have up to 23% of the injuries seen from grappling training alone are cervical related or cervical related, right? So around the neck region. So 23%. So if we can improve that neck strength, whether they're going for a takedown or like fighting the hands, whatever it happens to be, if we can improve neck strength, then decreasing the risk of injury gives them more time to get better at their sport. What we found is that concussions stem from head accelerations, so movement of the head at high speeds. We can see between 10 and 40 G forces per strike in MMA. We've been using mouthguard data to monitor these forces, and forces of up to 2,000 newtons, even higher, but the average of a strike is 2,000 newtons. Now, if you think of an average isometric mid-thigh pull, would probably be around 2,000 newtons. That's some serious force from one strike. So we've got a really big task ahead of us to try and help the athlete accept those forces to a point. What we have found is it's not just the neck. It is something called the neck or the trunk neck head coupling mechanism. So when we're testing the neck on a fixed frame dynamometer, we'll do flexion, extension, and lateral flexion. So the 4 force vectors, we'll do it in a static or isometric position so we can get maximal force out of that. And then we'll not only look at their absolute forces in each of those 4 ranges, but we'll also look at the ratios. So flexion to extension, flexion to lateral flexion, and then we can start targeting our prescriptions for neck in the S&C world. We do call it the neck strength coupling test. The reason we call it that, and not just the neck, is because we're not just testing the neck either. We want that coupling mechanism, the trunk neck head. And when we're doing some maximal voluntary contraction trials at the PI, we put it on, say, the erector spinae for neck extension, where you're pushing the back of your head to your back. And we found that the erector spinae contracted to 80% of its maximal voluntary contraction during that test. So let's be real about it. It's not just the neck we're testing, it's that whole chain, but that's okay because that's actually what we want to improve anyway. So it's cool. It's just, let's call a spade a spade. That's what we're looking at. And then when you get into the training and prescription component, let's say extension was your targeted force vector, then there's ways to improve or challenge that coupling mechanism within the gym. So even just something like going from a standing position with your like extension to maybe getting someone on a GHD and holding their position and doing their neck extension. Now you're involving the erector spinae, the glutes a little bit. So you're getting that chain improving and assisting towards that neck strength. So, you know, I feel like we've got a really good process. We call it the neck matrix, where we start with static strength, go to slow dynamic strength when we deem that they are strong enough based on their results for their weight class and their ratios are good enough. We would then move on to fast dynamic strength and then eventually reactive strength. The reason we do that is we've seen in the literature with soccer study, I always refer to this one because I think it's the clearest way to talk about it. They did a study on head stabilization in male and female soccer players, and males were able to stabilize their head better. However, females were able to engage their SCMs faster and to a greater percentage of their 1RM than males were. So basically what that's saying is they've got a more reactive neck, but they just don't have the force behind it to stabilize the head. So we really do need to work on maximal force first, then we can start expressing it. Now, what does that sound like? Regular S&C, right? Get them strong first, then get them powerful. So it's no different with that coupling. And look, so far it's worked really well in terms of static and slow dynamic really changing the testing results. We've seen that. We can get them up, the athlete up to the desired strength levels, and then we work on the fast dynamic and reactive. The problem is, how do you test if it's mitigated concussion? Like, it's a really, really difficult, challenging area to do it. Yeah. But we've definitely got feedback from the athletes saying, you know, I reckon that next stuff saved me on that. I got chinned and I was still standing. So that's pretty fortunate. I'll take that.
So you mentioned 4 force vectors. You didn't mention rotation as a reason that you don't test rotation.
It's a current question, and I love it, Blake, because we just haven't found a reliable and valid way to test that consistently. Because rotational forces, it's easier to knock an athlete out with rotational force than it is linear. Okay. However, the argument at the moment is that the same muscle groups are required to almost act like an anti-rotation when they accept those forces. So we're not trying to rotate the head faster. We're actually trying to put the brakes on. And so a static strength or anti-rotation would probably make a lot of sense. And that's just by doing our lateral flexion. We're going to engage the same muscle groups. The SCMs are going to be a large part of that anti-rotation. And at the moment, that's what we're going with. But that's, again, like we said at the start of this conversation, these are the conversations we love. And it's not to say that we're not going to get a rotational test in there. But at the moment, that's probably our discussion as to why we haven't got one in there. Not reliable and valid enough as yet. And also, if we're looking at anti-rotation, then the static strength is a pretty good spot at the moment where we are.
Awesome. Have you noticed asymmetry based on lateral sides? So, like that for myself as a wrestler, I tend to shoot with my head on one side and drive that way. Have you noticed any of that?
We have, not as bad as we think. What we have noticed is that particularly people from a grappling background have ridiculous absolute strength in their lateral flexors because of that reason. We did our own sort of cohort study, and we compared it with a study that a group did in quadruped position. So we changed from quadruped. We do all our testing in lying because it takes out the cheating component. And we found that our lateral flexors were maybe 200 newtons more than the general sort of college sports level athlete because of that reason. So it's just an interesting, and what that basically comes around to is we need to make sure we've got our own ratios for our sport because our athletes utilize lateral flexion a lot. We need to make sure that, in the literature, they talk about if your flexion to lateral flexion is 0.6 and below, then you increase risk of concussion. But our lateral flexors are so high that we're going to really predominantly need to work on the flexion to make sure that ratio balances out. And in fact, we've targeted 0.7, 0.8 to 1 flexion to lateral because of our cohort. So yeah, long story long, we have seen differences in lateral, but it's actually just more about their absolute forces that they can produce rather than asymmetries.
Okay. Very cool. Very cool. So I've looked through the journal a little bit for testing punching power. Y'all have tested on a budget medicine ball chest pass. Is there a way we could take it a step further? Like, is there cheap technology that coach such as myself operating on a local level could utilize to get some better data on punching power?
Definitely things like push band are a good thing to use, good tool to use. So a push band, just put it on your arm and you can get a velocity-based reading on what they call, I think it's called free run or free exercise or something like that, where there's free range of movement rather than a machine-based. You can throw that on your arm. Literally something else you could potentially do is like a loaded profile. So increase the ball weight and then look at a distance and have a look at the distance of the throw. So now you can look at like your sort of load velocity profile if you wanted to do it that way. Another one that I know, I think his name's Bill Miller, who works a lot in baseball. He has like a speed gun. So that's a pretty unique little tool. I don't know how much they are though, so I don't know if that's a cheap option, but I really liked that idea as well. He just gets them to throw it against the net and tracks them with a speed gun. So, it's about being creative and I guess if you're going to do your own variation, just being consistent with that test each time, and over time you'll get enough data to make sure that it's reliable.
Absolutely.
So you mentioned that uh in the gym, in the weight room, you're gonna do a lot like probably testing, force velocity profiling. At like UFC, is it sort of like baseball? It's a rotational sport. So like how much would you focus on like rotational strength, rotational power, or like the sequencing of the segment?
Yeah, they're going to be doing a lot of that in their technical work, right? So for us, it's more about giving them the opportunity to create mechanical power. Do they have the force capacity behind it? So as an example, with our tier 1 tests, the 2 load velocity profiles we do, one of them is a weighted counter movement jump load velocity profile. So unweighted or 0%, hands on hips, 20, 30, 40, 50, 60% body weight. They'll do 2 jumps at each of those ranges. For females, we'll cut off the 60% because we've noticed between 50 and 60, there's not enough difference to add in that 60%. But for males, we have. And then for the upper body, we'll do a half kneeling jammer punch throw. So this is a new test that's been created by our sports science team, Dr. Roman Foman and Brett Grelly. And they compared all of this to the landmine punch throw and just got much better, more accurate, valid results from the jammer throw. And so with that one, we'll do 0%, 5%, 0%, 10%, 20%, 30%. And then we can see what their upper body load velocity profile is. So if we go back to the counter movement jump, the way that we'll look at that is we'll be able to get power output from the forced X. And because we have minimum, average, and maximal for each weight class, we've got that many tests now, we can actually see where that athlete produces power or not across that line or across that load velocity profile. So let's say all weights were under the average. So they produce less than the average power across all loads, 0 to 60% for a male. We'll then look into the data a little bit further and go, well, why? Why did they decrease power? You know, the simple calculation of power is force times velocity, right? So now we've got those two components as well. We'll have force output in newtons and we'll have velocity in meters per second for those loads. And we can actually see sometimes the force they produce is higher than the average. So that's not what let them down. Their velocity is below average. So it's the velocity that let them down. Now, let's say that they're strong enough. Remember those tests that we talked about, the tier 2 tests, like your main traditional lifts and your other tier 1, which is your isometric mid-thigh pull. If you've ticked all the boxes for saying you're strong enough, well, that certainly shows in the force output that you're delivering at fast dynamic strength. It's the velocity component now. So when we come to programming, we're now going to want to move things, heavier things sometimes, or depending on where they are on that curve, or maybe it's lighter. So let's say you go 0 to 60%, maybe 40 to 60% of their body weight is where the velocity was really low. But before that, it was okay. Well, we know we've got to probably work more of our strength power-based work. If it's the other end, maybe we've got to work more of our power speed-based work. But velocity should be the focus. Now, going back to your original question, whether that's linear, rotational, or different planes of movement, that's up to you as a coach to decide what that athlete needs most of. But that's the expression of movement that we're actually focusing on. Does that make sense?
Yeah. I love it. I love it. So, man, I enjoyed this conversation. I think that's all the question we have for today. So, for those who are interested in what we're talking about today, where can they reach out to you?
Probably the best is on, say, Instagram. It's Gav_Pratt. Just hit me up on there and I can get back to you whenever I'm on there.
Got you, man.
Well, thank